There it goes.
Good morning. Last week we finished Mark chapter 7, and now we're going to begin our lesson in Mark chapter 8. We begin in verse 1 of Mark chapter 8 in the Adult Gospel Baptist Church Adult Sunday School class. In Mark 8 chapter 1 reads, "In those days the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples unto him, and saith unto them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have not been with me 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the way, for divers of them come from afar. And his disciples answered him, From whence can we satisfy these men? With bread here in the wilderness?" The situation was similar to the recent feeding of the 5,000. We see both a hungry multitude and a compassionate Jesus. So Jesus presented the dilemma to the disciples. What do we do? When the disciples answered, though, how can we feed these people? That we're here in the middle of nowhere, which is the wilderness. Doesn't mean they're literally in a forest. They're just away from all sorts of civilization. So we're in the middle of nowhere, and you're asking, what do we do? We can imagine Jesus hoping one of the disciples might say, Jesus, you did this before. We can do the same thing again. Jesus hoped they would regard his past faithfulness as a promise to meet their present need. You know, a lot of times when we have doubts, when we're going through a hard time, and we're saying, Lord, aren't you going to take care of this issue? And God's saying, didn't I not take care of the issue before? Why how have you lost your faith? He says, if I've taken care of you this issue beforehand, the other issue, and this other issue, I can definitely take care of you today. Moving on to verse 5. And he asked them, How many loaves have ye? And they said, 7. And he commanded the people to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and gave thanks and brake, and gave to disciples to set before them. And they did set them before the people. And they had a few small fishes. And he blessed and commanded to set them also before them. So they did eat and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets. And they that had eaten were about 4,000. And he sent them away. And straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples, and came into the parts of Dalmanutha. Jesus asked them to give their own food this time, before they used the food of the little boy. Before, they had used the food of a little boy, but this time Jesus made the disciples give. He intended them not only a running banquet, a slight come-off, but a full feast, a good meal, and therefore bade them to sit down and feed their fill. It wasn't just, people didn't just have a little, they had enough to be satisfied. Let me tell you something, they weren't Baptists. I don't think they'd be still eating today, because we're always hungry, When we're not hungry, we're still thinking of food. But they had enough that they were filled, and no one was hungry. Jesus did what he only could do, the creative miracle. But Jesus left to the disciples to do what they could do, the distribution of the bread. It seems that the disciples kept the fish from Jesus until they saw he could multiply the bread. They needed to see that they were safe giving everything to Jesus. Why were these not mentioned before, speaking of the fish? Could it be that they had withheld by the doubting disciples until they saw how the bread was multiplied? Apparently the fishes were blessed separately, then distributed as the bread had been. At the end of the meal, they gathered more bread than they had to begin with. This was a miraculous provision. The 7 large baskets showed that God provided out of his abundance. Some scholars argue this specific miracle never happened, They claim that this was merely a retelling of the feeding of the 5,000. Their main argument is, how could the disciples forget Jesus' previous work so quickly? Yet even mature Christians, like I said earlier, having experienced God's power and provision, sometimes go on an act of unbelief. This wasn't so surprising after all. Moving on to verse 11. And the Pharisees came forth, began to question him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and saith, Why doth this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say to you, there shall no sign be given unto this generation. In the mind of the Pharisees, this was not a request for another miracle of the time Jesus had already done. They asked for a dramatic sign from the sky, something similar to Elijah's fire from heaven. When speaking about testing him, this was not a friendly encounter. The word tested could be translated tempted. The Pharisees tempted Jesus to perform a miraculous sign just as Satan tempted him to do so in the wilderness. This attack and the unbelief it showed distressed Jesus. He was amazed at the unbelief and the audacity of these religious leaders. The psi physical is called spiritual, a sense of irreconcilable enmity, invincible unbelief, and coming doom. That means that Jesus was sorely distressed because, let's be honest, he has shown many miracles. He has done many wonderful things. If these people really were concerned about the Word of God, they would recognize that what Jesus is doing is exactly what the Messiah was supposed to do. But their unbelief blinded them. It didn't matter what Jesus did. Jesus could have brought flowers from the heaven. He could have caused birds to dance in the air. It didn't matter what type of miracle he would have performed. They still wouldn't believe. They still wouldn't believe. Jesus is not about wasting time, and all they would do is waste his time. This demand for a special sign was an extreme example of the arrogance and pride of the Pharisees towards Jesus. Essentially, they said, you have done a lot of small-time miracles. Come on to the big leagues and really show us something. Jesus refused because his miracles are not done with the intention of convincing hardened unbelievers. Instead, Jesus did miracles to show the power of God in the context of mercy. Those who believe that if people see enough signs they will come to faith presume to know more than Jesus did. He condemned the generation who saw the sign. You know, you see this today. A lot of people, skeptics, will say, well, if God is real, he should prove. There's never enough proof to prove God is real. If you can't see that yourself, if God doesn't, well, the Holy Spirit doesn't open your heart, you won't see the existence of God until he does. You know, people think they say God can't be real because if he was, there'd be no suffering in the world. That has nothing to do with the reality of God. In fact, it shows that of all creatures on the planet, they live in harmony with the planet, but we cannot. Everywhere we go, we either subdue or destroy. That is something that the Bible reveals about mankind, and the Bible shows what is true. Then we can believe what the Bible says is true. Now moving on to verse 13. And he left them and entered in the ship and again departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. And he charged them, saying, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. This leaven wasn't merely yeast, but a pinch of dough left over from the previous batch, as in the making of sourdough bread. This was how bread was commonly leavened in the ancient world. And a little pinch of dough from the old lump could make a whole new lump of dough rise and puff up. So the work of leaven was considered an illustration of the work of sin and pride. The presence of a little can corrupt a large amount. Sometimes the Jew used the word leaven much as we would use the term original sin, or the natural sin of human nature, as written by Barclay. Jesus essentially said, beware the evil way the Pharisees and Herod think of the kingdom of the Messiah. For a short time I will reveal the truth of it to you. Both Herod and the Pharisees idolized the kingdom as a domineering power and authority. Herod saw it more as a political power and authority, and the Pharisees saw it as a more spiritual power and authority, but they still saw the kingdom in this high-minded way. In other words, they were so focused on what they wanted, they were missing the big picture. Moving on to verse 16. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, It is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he said to them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not, ye neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes see not, having ears hear not? And do ye not remember when I brake the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? They said to him, 12. And when when 7 among 4,000, how many baskets of full fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, How is it that you don't understand? See, they were Baptists. Jesus is trying to make this really important point, and guess what? They're thinking about food. They're still thinking about food. They just ate, they're full, and yet they're still thinking about food. When Jesus spoke with 11 of the Pharisees and 11 of Herod, the disciples didn't relate it to a spiritual idea at all. All they could think of was the bread that goes into the stomach, not the bread that goes into the soul. Jesus confronted the disciples over their lack of understanding. From this we know that they could have done better than this. They could have understood more if they applied themselves more. Their understanding should have been based on seeing what Jesus really did. We can always take the past faithfulness of God as a promise for his continued love and care. This is of the situations where we wish we had a recording of Jesus' words to hear what tone of voice he used. Was it a tone of communicating anger, concern, or frustration? We know that even when Jesus confronted his disciples, he did it in love. That we may not hear his voice. Was he frustrated? Was he angry? Was he just disappointed? We don't hear that tone. But we can know from Jesus' past work that anytime he chastises even us, it is never just to be a bully or be mean, but it is always based out of love. And that concludes today's lesson.